Deep in the heart of a lush green sanctuary, where nature's quiet wonders unfold every day, a mother stood cradling her newborn. The tiny baby, wrapped in a soft blue blanket, shifted gently in her arms. Her eyes shimmered with a warmth only new mothers know, but she wasn't alone. Just beyond the safety of the glass, another mother was watching. Towering, strong, yet still, with a gaze that spoke volumes, stood Coco, the gorilla. She was known by the caretakers for her calm nature, her quiet intelligence, and her deep, expressive eyes. For weeks, Coco had watched the woman's belly grow during her visits. She had noticed. She had remembered. And now the woman was back, with a fragile life in her arms. As she stepped closer to the enclosure, Coco moved forward too, slowly, curiously. Her massive hands hung gently at her sides, then ever so softly she lifted one and pressed it to the glass. Not in fear, not in confusion, but in reverence. The woman looked at her, smiled, and lifted the baby just a little higher. The world seemed to fall quiet. Even the nearby waterfall hushed its roar. Then in a moment, no one could have predicted, Coco did something that left everyone watching completely stunned. In the heart of a sprawling green forest, tucked away from the chaos of the world, sat a sanctuary where the wild was at peace. Birdsong echoed between the trees, and a waterfall whispered in the distance. Among the residents of this paradise was Coco, a silverback gorilla with soulful eyes and a presence that humbled anyone who saw her. She was no ordinary animal. Caretakers often said she felt things deeper than words could explain, and for the past few weeks Coco had been paying special attention to a particular visitor. A woman, always calm, always smiling. And as the woman's belly grew with life, so too did Coco's curiosity. She would sit close to the glass when the woman came near, eyes focused. Still, something stirred within her, not just interest, but understanding. It was as if she knew what was coming. And in the silence of the sanctuary, an invisible bond was forming, one that crossed species, one that words couldn't describe. The caretakers watched, fascinated, but even they couldn't predict what would happen next. When the woman finally returned, she wasn't alone. She carried a tiny, swaddled baby in her arms. The moment was quiet, almost holy, as if the forest held its breath. Coco noticed immediately. She rose from her resting spot and approached the glass. And with that single movement, a moment years in the making had begun. Coco stared through the glass, unmoving. Her large, dark eyes locked on the baby, wide and glistening. There was no fear in them, no confusion, only something softer, something ancient. The mother hesitated, just for a second, then took a step forward, closer to the barrier. She held the baby up gently, allowing Coco to see, and in that instant the air shifted. There was no sound but the whisper of the waterfall. Coco placed her palm against the glass, massive, rough and powerful, yet resting like a feather. It was a greeting, but also something deeper, a blessing, a recognition. Her lips moved slightly as if mimicking a coo. The baby stirred, letting out a soft cry. Coco's brow furrowed, concern. Then something unexpected happened. Coco reached to her chest and tapped it twice, a sign of affection her caretakers had come to recognize. A gorilla's way of saying, "I feel you." The woman smiled through tears. No words were exchanged, but in that quiet exchange of gestures, two mothers from different worlds understood each other completely. It wasn't the first time Coco had seen a baby. Years ago, she had one of her own, a small, fragile creature she had cradled with all the gentleness in her enormous hands. But fate had taken her baby away. Too soon. The caretakers had seen her grieve. They had seen her rock back and forth in silence for days, and eventually they had seen her grow quiet. But never cold. Something in her heart had stayed open, waiting, watching. So when the human mother returned with her own child, it was as if something long buried came to life in Coco again. Not sadness, not longing, but warmth. She pressed both hands to the glass now. Her breathing slowed, and for a moment she closed her eyes. Perhaps remembering, perhaps imagining. The woman didn't move. She seemed to understand. There was nothing to fear here, only a connection most people would never believe unless they saw it, and here it was playing out in front of them. Behind the scenes, sanctuary staff stood silently, stunned. They had seen Coco interact with many visitors, but this was different. There was a reverence in her actions, almost human. One of the older caretakers, a woman who had been with Coco since she was young, wiped away a tear. "She remembers," she whispered. Another staff member raised a camera to record, but even he hesitated. It felt like a sacred moment, not something to be interrupted. Coco began making soft vocalizations, low, musical rumbles, the kind she made only when completely relaxed. The baby responded with a quiet gurgle, as if recognizing her voice. The woman holding the baby began to cry, not out of fear, but from the sheer, unexplainable beauty of the encounter. It was raw, real, not rehearsed or forced. No zoo tricks, no trained behavior, just two mothers, one human, one gorilla, sharing something that transcended everything: species, language, logic, only heart. And then it happened. The baby stirred again, this time more purposefully. A tiny hand emerged from the folds of the blanket, fingers uncurled, slow, curious, and reached out toward the glass. The gesture made everyone watching gasp. On the other side, Coco mirrored the movement. She extended a finger toward the baby's tiny palm. Of course, they could not touch. A thick pane of protective glass stood between them. But in that moment, it didn't matter. They reached for each other with everything but skin. The baby cooed softly, pressing its hand flat against the glass. Coco stayed completely still, letting the moment live. It was no longer just observation, it was participation, recognition. The boundaries between them, physical, evolutionary, seemed to vanish. What remained was pure and profoundly moving. The baby shifted once more, adjusting its tiny body in the warmth of its mother's arms. Its eyelids fluttered lazily open, revealing soft, unfocused eyes, unaware of the power of this moment. But then, slowly, instinctively, a tiny hand wriggled free from the blanket, fingers spread, reaching forward, tender and trembling, toward the glass, toward Coco. Everyone watching went still. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. The baby's hand pressed against the cold glass, and as if guided by an invisible thread, Coco mimicked the motion. Her enormous leathery palm touched the exact spot. Finger to finger, hand to hand, a baby and a beast. Yet somehow, not so different. Coco didn't blink. Her dark eyes held the baby in a protective stare, as if memorizing every tiny feature. A low hum rumbled from her chest, deep and melodic. It was a sound the caretakers knew well. Comfort, safety, love. The baby cooed softly in response, unfazed by the creature before it. There was no fear, only innocence meeting gentleness. A connection that had nothing to do with species and everything to do with the language of life. The mother watched in silent awe. She held her child closer, not to shield him, but to offer him more. More of this, more of her. This moment was not just an encounter, it was a memory being born, one that would never fade. The caretakers knew Coco's past, her joys and her losses. She had once cradled her own baby, years ago, under these very trees. But that life had been brief. Too brief. Since then, she had rarely shown interest in younger animals or humans, until now. This baby awakened something dormant in her. Not sorrow, but something more healing, a restoration. The gentle way she moved, the way she breathed slowly, deeply. It was the same way she used to behave with her own child. As the baby blinked at her through the glass, Coco tilted her head. It was a small gesture, but full of emotion, recognition, gratitude, maybe even longing. The mother placed her own hand next to Coco's on the glass. 3 lives, separated by pains but joined in something stronger than touch. The moment dragged out like a slow dream, yet no one dared to speak. Even the wind, usually restless through the leaves, held its breath. Coco began to sway gently, side to side, a calming rhythm. The baby responded by yawning, nestling deeper into the blanket. And still, Coco didn't move away. She stayed, watched, protected, as if guarding the baby through the invisible wall. It wasn't a performance, it was a memory being rewritten, not in words, but in stillness. A silent promise that love, no matter the form, never disappears. What is it about eyes that speaks louder than language? Coco's gaze held centuries of emotion. You could feel it, in the way she looked at the baby, then the mother, then back again. There was no demand, no impatience, only presence, presence. She blinked slowly, her expression softening. And in that silence, she seemed to say, "I understand." Caretakers nearby found themselves overwhelmed with emotion. Some wept. Others stood frozen, hands covering their mouths. One caretaker later said, "It felt like she was speaking to our souls, because she was, without a sound, without a word." Coco was telling a story of motherhood, of grief, of hope reborn. The mother, tear-streaked and smiling, whispered, "She sees him." Not just with her eyes, but with her whole being. There was no fear in Coco, only reverence. The baby, now asleep, had brought peace to a place already serene. But this was different. This was sacred. Coco turned her gaze toward the trees, then back at the baby, as if acknowledging the cycle of life, the pain, the joy, the miracle, and then just for a moment, she pressed her forehead to the glass, a gesture of trust, of blessing. Everyone knew. They had just witnessed something that would never happen again, a message, delivered not in words, but in wonder. The quiet awe of the sanctuary was soon captured in a single photo. One image. The mother holding her newborn. Coco, eyes wide, hand pressed gently to the glass. It was shared online with a simple caption. The gorilla wanted to see the baby. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. People around the world couldn't believe it. Some thought it was fake. Others felt deeply moved. But those who were, they knew this wasn't staged. This wasn't a stunt. It was real, raw, and more human than most human moments. The internet did what it always does, debated, speculated, but a deeper conversation began to unfold about animals, about empathy, about the souls behind those eyes. For days, news outlets shared the story. Experts weighed in on gorilla intelligence. Some claimed it proved Koko had maternal instincts still alive. Others called it a spiritual moment, but everyone agreed on one thing. It was unforgettable. Koko became a symbol overnight of peace, of connection, of the simple power of love, even through glass, even between species. Children in schools watched the video during class. Parents talked to their kids about what it meant to be kind, not just to people, but to all living things. Zoologists were flooded with questions from curious minds. What did she feel?
Why did she act like that?
Do animals know what love is? And somewhere, in a quiet corner of the sanctuary, Koko rested peacefully, her work
Unknowingly done. She hadn't meant to teach, but
she had. She reminded the world that compassion isn't just a human trait. It lives in nature, in the eyes of a
gorilla in the reach of a baby's hand.
Mother returned weeks later, this time with a slightly bigger baby in her arms.
Recognized them instantly. She pressed her hand to the glass again,
Little more eagerly this time. The baby giggled. The mother cried.
Again, and somewhere deep in the forest.
The world felt just a bit more connected. Because of Koko. Because of that moment. Because love, the purest kind, doesn't need words at all. Years later,
people still talk about that day, the day a gorilla asked to see a baby and gave the world something
to believe in. That photo still circulates, still inspires, still teaches. The sanctuary grew in popularity not for entertainment, but for empathy. Visitors came not to see animals, but to learn from them. Koko's health slowly declined with age, but her spirit never did. Every time the woman visited, she'd bring her son, now older, curious, kind, and each time Koko responded with the same gentle eyes, the same hand on the glass, until one day the glass was quiet. Koko had passed, peacefully, without pain, surrounded by the only family she ever knew, her caretakers, and the forest she called home. But her story didn't end there, because that bond, that moment, changed everything. It reminded us that we are not so different, that love transcends form, shape, and species, and that sometimes the most powerful stories are told without a single word.